Hi, this is Dominic Pace, who plays Gekko the Bounty Hunter from The Mandalorian, and you are listening to Star Wars Comics in Canon.
Hello there and welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon, your guide to the wider Star Wars canon through the comic book lens. And to take you on this journey, I'm your host, Mike Burton. And so brings another book review. So my friends, this week I am tackling the third of the High Republic main air quotes adult novels. So this takes place still in the first phase, but this is the third wave. So this is The Fallen Star by Claudia Gray. Now, if you haven't listened to a book review of mine before, let me just run through a couple of bits that I do. So the first third or so is going to be spoiler free. So I'm going to give my thoughts on it, tell you about where it falls in the timeline, just a bit of information that you'd find either just from the press release of this very book or just really small amounts of information, including like the blurb and things like that. So no spoilers at all and just my general thoughts on it. Then I move on to slightly more spoiler territory where I speak about the characters a little bit more, I speak about the themes a little bit more, and then some light plot information that you'd find out from the first chapter or two of the book itself, and then I give plenty of warning, and then I give a big spoilery kind of review. The final part is more so me giving a brief summary of the plot, just for those individuals who don't have time to consume all High Republic content or all content in the Star Wars canon, and want to have an understanding of the just broad strokes of plots and things, and just to find out other pieces of information as well, just so you're kind of kept in the loop without having to read a 300 odd page book, including for all the other book reviews. So that's generally how I structure my book reviews. So if you haven't checked out my reviews on like The Jedi, The Rising Storm, or their accompanying novels, which are the junior novels and the young adult novels, which are all in the same waves of the High Republic, I have tackled all of those. You can either just type in whatever book review you want and then type in comics after it or canon after it, and it should come up wherever you're listening on the podcasting apps or things. But if you're listening on YouTube, you can just go into the playlists. I've got a playlist for the High Republic, and I also have a playlist for book reviews. So lots of places where you can listen to my other book reviews on High Republic stuff and also non-High Republic stuff. But with that in mind, let's get into the first third of my review, which is the spoiler-free thoughts. So first of all, The Fallen Star, as I said, is the third book of the main adult books in the first phase of the High Republic. So the High Republic so far has been split into 3 phases, so phase 1, 2 and 3. As of recording this, phase 2 has not even been released yet. It is starting in October 2022, and each phase has got waves within it. So the way phase 1 worked is wave 1, 2 and 3. Wave 1 was Light of the Jedi, the first arc of the Star Wars Marvel comics, the first arc of the Star Wars Adventures comics, then as well as these 2 supporting novels, because there's normally a main adult novel and then a young adult novel and also a junior novel. And as I've reviewed the junior novels and the young adult novels, I say they are really, really good. The junior novels especially really surprise me. Every time I read them, they are just fantastic, and that is going to be the thing that I read next. So the next book review after this is going to be the junior novel of phase 1, wave 3, and that is Mission to Disaster, and then after that I'll do the young adult novel, which is Midnight Horizon. And the way they generally work is the main plot details happen in the adult novel. The young adult books often take place like a little bit after the main adult novel, so they kind of serve as, I deem it as almost an extended epilogue or just a side story, something that has got characters that aren't explicitly affected by the events of the main novel as much as other characters would be, but still have an impact in the galaxy as a whole, whereas the junior novel generally is something that is quite highly affected by the events of the adult novel, but don't go into the specific graphic details, because in the adult novels there are elements of horror and there's character deaths and other things like that happen, and the junior novels do a good way of telling you what events occurred in the main adult novels without having to go into the details, but also telling their own story in itself. And some of the characters in the junior novels are absolutely brilliant, like Vernestra Rwoh, who is one of my favourite characters in the High Republic. She debuted in the first junior novel, which was A Test of Courage, and then she appears in the young adult novel Out of the Shadows, which was the last book review that I did, and she's once again the central character in Mission to Disaster, which is the junior novel for the third wave, first phase of the High Republic. So that's generally where it all takes place, and I imagine by now you guys are all aware that the High Republic takes place around 200 years before the Phantom Menace, but that is specifically this first phase. Then the second phase is going to serve as a prequel, so the second phase is going to be 150 years before the first phase. So this means from October, when I'm tackling the next wave of the comics and the variety of books and things, they're going to be taking place around 350 years before the Phantom Menace, which is around 490 years before the Battle of Yavin, which obviously is when A New Hope occurred. So that's the general idea of the timeline, and then from what the High Republic authors have said, it seems like Phase 3 is then going to be a sequel to Phase 1. So it's kind of going to go similarly to how the Godfather trilogy of movies did, but also how the trilogies of Star Wars movies did, you know, originals, prequels, sequels. That's generally a good way to kind of understand what's going on. And just a little plug here for myself is that I actually have spoken with both Claudia Gray, the author of this book, and also Cavan Scott, who is the author of the second book, which is The Rising Storm, as well as the High Republic comics and also the miniseries The Monster of Temple Peak. So I've spoken to both of those High Republic authors. I believe I released them on this very feed if you're listening on Comics in Motion. If you're on YouTube, then you'll be able to check it out there as well. But I also spoke to them on the feed of my other podcast, Genuine Chit-Chat. I spoke with Claudia Gray at the tail end of 2020, so that was just before the High Republic books came out, and that was when she was doing promo for the Into the Dark book, which is the first young adult novel. It's part of Phase 1, Wave 1, and it features the Drengir and how they kind of got into the galaxy and things. So I've done a book review for that book as well as speaking to Claudia Gray about that. And then I spoke with Cavan Scott a couple weeks ago, and he spoke to me about his book, The Rising Storm, the High Republic as a whole, and some of the other projects he's been involved with as well. And the conversation with Cavan Scott also has full video to it as well. So if you want to check that out on YouTube, you can. If you just want to listen to it, then yeah, just type in Cavan Scott Star Wars interview. It'll be one of those. It'll be on this very feed. In fact, it should only be a couple weeks before this episode had dropped. So if you found this one, you're listening on Comics in Motion, you should be able to go back and listen to that. And I do highly recommend it because it works really well as its own thing. But also if you're a consumer of High Republic content, it adds a little bit of extra flavour. But that's the kind of background information I wanted to get into. So let's get into my thoughts specifically of this book. So starting off, the best thing to do would be to compare it to the prior two books. So we started with Light of the Jedi, then it was The Rising Storm, and then it was The Fallen Star. I'm not going to compare it to the junior novels or the young adult novels because they're all structured in a slightly different way, and it's just a bit easier rather than trying to compare like 9 books together. So between these three, The Fallen Star, I will clarify by saying it is a really, really good book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was brilliant. It is one of the better of the Star Wars novels I have read. However, I think of the 3, I believe it is probably the weakest. And I want to clarify that's nothing against Claudia Gray or anything like that, but the story itself is a lot more self-contained, it's a lot more isolated, and it's not dissimilar in a sense to how Into the Dark was as well. And that's not because of Claudia Gray, it's just the story that the High Republic authors wanted to tell. And due to me consuming other content of the High Republic, as well as seeing some of the press that got released for this, what happens in this book, you can basically tell that from almost anything. So the name of the book alludes to it, so does any of the promo material, so does the final issue of the High Republic comics, issue 15. So lots of elements of it, one would already know what's going to happen in this book. It's more so how it happened and who survived, who died. That was what was a lot of the stuff around the press and the promo information of this final wave of the High Republic. It wasn't what's going to happen. It was a very clear image of what is going to happen, but the question was who survived this event. So that immediately, for me, made it one step lower a little bit than the other ones because I already knew what was going to happen. Not dissimilar to when prequels get released of certain characters like the Solo movie. You know, you watch the Solo movie, you know Han Solo isn't going to die, you know Lando and Chewie aren't going to die, and you know the Falcon is in some form going to survive because you know that they're characters that are in the original trilogy. So even from starting, before Solo even came out, I already knew certain characters were going to survive. And with this, it was kind of the opposite. I didn't know which characters were going to survive. I had some hopes, I had some thoughts. I didn't know who was going to, but I knew a specific event that was going to happen. So I'm not going to say explicitly what that event is until I get to the second review, the second part of this review, because as I said, it's written everywhere. It's even in the name of this book. But the way I would compare these books, after some time to think about it, I think the ratings that I would give to the books out of 10, which I don't generally do. I do on my Patreon a little bit because I do other book reviews that are some Legend stuff and some non-High Republic but still canon books. So I've done A New Dawn, A Shatterpoint, which is Legends, Darth Plagueis, which is Legends, Last Shot, and Dark Disciple. So I've done reviews for all of those, and I generally gave them things out of 10. But on this feed for the High Republic stuff, I generally haven't. But just to compare the three together, I would say Light of the Jedi is an easy 9 out of 10 book. 9 out of 10 because it's just brilliant in so many ways. My only issue really with it was just that it's a lot to deal with. The first third of the book, there's so much going on, and that's how they wanted it to be. And it works well, but sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming to figure out which characters are doing what and stuff. And I did read this book because the Patreon books I generally listen to on Audible, but these books I have physical copies of and I read them. So like the Jedi, my only real qualm with it was just it's a lot to deal with, there's a lot going on, and it's, kind of hitting the ground running, which is what they wanted, and it works, but it was a bit overwhelming at times. The Rising Storm, I'd give 9.5 out of 10. I think it's nearly perfect. I don't really think there's many major flaws in it. I don't think there's anything that could have been necessarily massively improved, but I'm very cautious when giving a book a 10 out of 10 rating. I think with The Rising Storm, once again, the blurb kind of gave away certain elements of it. So I'm just going to say it says on the back about there's a Republic fair and the Nihil are preparing to attack. And it's like, well, we know the Nihil are going to attack the Republic fair then. So although the plot wasn't as clear as it is for this book, The Fallen Star, the 0.5, not giving it a perfect score, was just kind of, you knew what was going to happen. It was just kind of waiting for it to happen. I know Cavan Scott, he loves horror, and a lot of the elements of The Rising Storm and Cavan Scott's other works have got a lot of horror elements to it. And when you go and watch, Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, the question isn't what's going to happen. It's when is Freddy Krueger going to attack? When is Jason Voorhees or his mum going to attack? When are these elements going to occur? Not what's going to occur, if you see what I mean. And so with The Rising Storm, I got that, but I think there are so many other intertwined elements, and because we already knew who the characters were, you really want to know, what happened after Light of the Jedi? Who survived? Who didn't do this? What's going to happen here? So I think it was a little bit more open-ended, but that's why I wouldn't give it a perfect score. This one, I think I'd give an 8.5. So I still think it's an excellent book. I think it's definitely worth a read, and it will not disappoint you when you read this after reading the other two. It's still definitely in the same league as them, but because of knowing a bit about the plot, it did take away a little bit from it. Part of that was myself, because I did read the High Republic comics. I read all of those, so it ended with the 15th issue, and I mentioned this in my review of that, which I'd released, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago on this feed, once again, so you can check that out, or it's in the High Republic playlist if you're listening on YouTube, so I go through the plot details of the comics, etc. But in that, where those comics finish is about a third through this book, and I was aware of that going in, but I basically ordered a signed version of The Fallen Star. It was signed by Claudia Gray, but it arrived like a month after the release date, so I didn't want to stop reading other High Republic content, but I did hold off on reading certain ones, but I couldn't resist reading the comics. So obviously that in some ways I did shoot myself in the foot, but there wasn't a surprise when I read that comic when a certain thing happened. It was quite obvious. It's even on the cover of the comic, so you don't even need to read the comic, you just need to have seen it in some manner. So that marked off like a small amount of points. But in all honesty, because it's such an insular story, because it all takes place, apart from like 1 or 2 chapters, it's pretty much all taking place in this one location. And although that works really well, and you're flitting from character to character, and there's a lot going on, and kudos to Claudia Gray for being able to write this, it just didn't make me want to pick up and continue reading the same way the other 2 books did. When I started Light of the Jedi, I flew through the first third. I could not put it down. Then after the first third, when things in the plot kind of calmed down a little bit, then I was still reading, still intrigued, but I wasn't like having to pick up the book, never could put it down. It wasn't quite that amount, but then when you get towards the end of Light of the Jedi, it started that up again. Rising Storm, the entire time, I couldn't put the book down at all. When I was working, I was excited to come home and be able to read it. I was finding any time to be able to read The Rising Storm. I could not put that book down. It's one of my favourite Star Wars books ever. With this one, it took me a little while to read. I've had it now for several weeks, and I read the first quarter or so of it, and I was really into it and things, and then I put it down because I was reading some other things and doing some other stuff, and I didn't rush to pick it up again. And I just think that although quite a lot of things happens to certain characters, there's many characters that die in this, and although that does generally for me make it like a good plot, and there's lots of twists and turns and lots of exciting stuff that does happen, I just didn't have that need to pick it up again. I did want to read it and finish it for this podcast, and because I want to consume the other High Republic content that I know is set during this, and I didn't want anything else to get spoiled for me, certain characters or anything. But I just found that because I kind of knew what was happening, and that this was the end of this phase and all the promo stuff and everything kind of culminating together, when I finished the book, I was like, oh, that was really cool. It had a lot of stuff in there I didn't expect, and lots of character stuff I really, really enjoyed. But the middle part of the book, it had, and I'm going to use the word I use all the time on my Patreon, it had a bit of a lull. There was just this period of time where everyone's kind of in the book trying to figure out what's going on, and nothing is explicitly happening, and there's several chapters where it's all like a build-up to the next big thing that happens. You know, the first third of the book, something happens, then there's the next third trying to figure it out, and then the last third is when, you know, you're at the 11th hour trying to solve whatever problem's raised. Well, with this, it was like that, but there was a few chapters where just nothing was specifically happening. It was kind of, you know, as a horror fan, you could kind of see it's, you know, after you've seen the main monster and then it disappears for a bit, it's like, oh, when's it going to come back? When's it going to get people? Kind of like that. But I just didn't have that same grab of really, really wanting to pick it up again. But then when I got to the last third, or more so the last quarter, then it was once again, I'm really excited for this. And in fact, I recently went on a holiday to Malta and I took my book with me, and I found most nights when I was reading, I was actually gravitating towards reading comics. I was actually reading Moon Knight, funnily enough. But when I was on the plane and I was like, all right, I'm going to read The Fallen Star, you know, I want to finish it and things, the whole plane ride zoomed by. I was on the plane for about 3.5 hours. I think I was reading Fallen Star for about 2.5 hours uninterrupted, and it was fantastic. And I'd almost say for people, it's not always easy to, and it's definitely not for my life, because I generally read books and comics before bed or at lunchtimes at work and things. So I only normally have an hour or so, maybe an hour and a half, to be able to read things at a time. Whereas I feel like with The Fallen Star, the best way to consume this would be to somehow push off like 9 hours, like block off 9 hours in your calendar and have like 3 hours a time, and maybe have like a few days between each block off. So if you have the time for it, it'd almost be worth doing like reading 3 hours on like a Wednesday, then if 3 more hours like a Saturday, and then 3 more hours like on the Sunday, or maybe a following couple of days, just because I really feel like it would benefit from that. If it took me 9 hours to read, I can't remember how long it took me to read this book, but however long it would take, just block off several hours and try and read big chunks at a time. Because I was finding I'd read like 2 or 3 chapters before bed, and then I'd pick it up a couple days later and read another 2 or 3 chapters. And when I'd start the chapter, I'd be like, I can't really remember what's happening, because everything is happening basically in real time. Like from the start of the book, after maybe the 5th chapter or so to the end, in the story, it only takes place over several hours. I'd probably say maybe a push 6 hours. Maybe this whole book, you could argue, takes place over 10 hours at a push, but I'd say maybe 4 to 6 hours is the scale of this book, which is not a long period of time when it compares to some of the other books where you even have time jumps within it, or there's like, oh, preparations for the fair. Okay, here's before the fair, then a few days pass, then there's the fair itself, which is over like a day, and then there's the aftermath of the fair, which is another day or so. So more so like a week. And I think with Star Wars, a lot of the time it is, each movie is generally speaking, aside from time jumps, taking place over a few days or maybe even a couple of weeks, whereas all in one day is a lot. And I think The Last Jedi was probably the closest film to that, and I do love that movie, but it did feel a bit like, oh, this is taking place moments after the last movie, and it all takes place within like a couple of days, and it just doesn't give a lot of space for growth and or even time to breathe, because everything's happening so quick. And there's a lot of films and books and things that work when it's a very insular story. It's like this took place over a few hours, but generally speaking, I'm not as much of a fan of that. I'd rather have a few days and things like that when the story allows for it. So I just found, there was a bit of a lull, because I was reading the chapters, and you read a chapter and it's picking up immediately after the last chapter, and if you can't remember every line of what happened in the last chapter, it's harder to remember where you were. So I was finding that each time I'd pick up the book, I'd have to read the previous chapter, or at least half of the previous chapter, to work out where I was. Whereas generally when you get stories which are like, oh, blah 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 is going here, and then the next chapter is blah 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 arrives at blah blah blah, they are looking for this, then they go find it. This is more like blah 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 does this, and then is about to do something, and then the chapter ends, and then the next chapter starts, and then they continue doing that thing they were halfway through doing, but you aren't reminded what it was. It's kind of like that in some ways. I'm explaining it quite badly, I think. But please let me know. Please contact me and tell me if I'm explaining this element terribly. But yeah, I thought the book was really good. I really did enjoy it. I don't want to sound like I'm just, being very negative over this. I really, really did enjoy the book. I thought it was fantastically written. I think the humour in it is really good. Claudia Gray has got a brilliant, I love all the High Republic author stuff, but I think Claudia Gray's got the best humour, or at least she writes the funniest stuff. It's not like a book where you're reading it and you're laughing out loud every 5 minutes, because it's not that kind of book, and the themes in it are quite heavy. But Claudia Gray, she did it in Into the Dark, and she's done it in her other books as well. I've read all her Star Wars books, and she did it in this, where you just get the odd line of dialogue that's just quite funny. It makes you smirk while you're reading it, or maybe a little bit of a giggle and things, and they're just really nice moments that break the tension, and that is what Claudia Gray is excellent at. She's brilliant at writing characters, and she's brilliant at little nods of humour, which I think works really, really well in Star Wars, because although I love my Star Wars to be dark and brooding and intense stuff going on, especially the original trilogy, it has so many little moments of humour. It's not laugh out loud funny, it's not like a joke. Last Jedi kind of has more jokey humour and things, which is what Rian Johnson does quite well in a lot of ways. Doesn't always land in Last Jedi, but I appreciate the effort. But in Star Wars, in the original trilogy especially, it's more just little moments. There's a little line of dialogue that a character says something kind of funny, or some character gives another character a certain look. Like Han Solo is very much written as a humorous character in certain elements. He's got a lot of funny things to say, and 3PO and R2-D2 have a lot of little funny interactions, but there's not like an explicit joke or slapsticky comedy. It's just humorous interactions with the characters. And that's what Claudia Gray does incredibly well. And there's certain characters that I'll mention in the next part of this review which work really well in that. So the book structure has got the humour, it's very insular, it happens over a very short space of time, it's very intense, and when you're reading certain parts, it is very fast-paced, and you can really feel that. And I think she does that incredibly well. There's just the character journeys in this. There's one character specific who has such an interesting journey, and they became one of my favourite characters in this. They were already one of my favourite characters, especially from The Rising Storm. Like the Jedi, I was like, yeah, that's a character. In Rising Storm, I was like, oh, this is a character that's quite interesting. And then this book, I was like, oh yeah, this is my jam. This is one of my favorite characters, and I love it. And I love how it intertwines with the High Republic comics as well. If you've read the High Republic comics, especially the last one, you'll know that it ends with a certain character landing on a certain planet. What I really liked about this book is that you get a moment where you see that character doing that thing from their perspective, but then a few chapters on, or quite a few chapters on, you then get what happened afterwards. So you do get like an epilogue to the High Republic comics, which works really well, and I really liked that element of it as well. But that's going to be it for my spoiler-free stuff, or I'm going to either constantly repeat myself or start spoiling things. So this is your warning of minor spoilers. So now I'm going to talk about some of the characters lightly. I'm going to talk about the themes in the book itself as well. And then after that, I'm going to delve a bit more into the plot and stuff. But I will give you guys plenty of warning before I go into the plot itself. But this is now your warning. If you want to go into The Fallen Star knowing absolutely nothing and you've managed to avoid all of the stuff online and all of that information, then kudos to you and you can go read the book. But this is now what I'm going to say. I'm going to basically, there's the big event that happens in this book. I'm going to say what that event is, but I'm also going to read out for you the blurb, and also I think I'm going to read out the crawl as well, so you get a bit of information about that, and then I'll kind of jumpstart it from there. So here we go. I'll start with the blurb. Time and again, the vicious raiders known as the Nile have sought to bring the golden age of the High Republic to a fiery end. Time and again, the High Republic has emerged, battered and wary, but victorious, thanks to its Jedi protectors, and there is no monument to their cause grander than the Starlight Beacon. Hanging like a jewel in the Outer Rim, the beacon embodies the High Republic at the apex of its aspirations, a hub of culture and knowledge, a bright torch against the darkness of the unknown, and an extended hand of welcome to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. As survivors and refugees flee the Nile's attacks, the beacon and its crew stand ready to shelter and heal. The grateful knights and Padawans of the Jedi Order stationed there finally have a chance to recover from the pains of their injuries and the grief of their losses. Following the death of Loden Greatstorm, Bel Zettifar must now take up his master's mantle. Elzar Mann is rebuilding his connection to the light, even as his rage towards the Nile and his forbidden feelings for Avar Kriss simmer. Elzar's escorts back to the beacon, the mismatched found family of the vessel, are enjoying a quick opportunity to kick up their feet on the finest space station in the known galaxy. Those of them who have feet, anyway. But the storm they have thought has passed still rages. They are simply caught in its eye. Marchion Ro, the true mastermind of the Nile, is preparing his most daring attack yet, one designed to snuff out the light of the Jedi. So that's the blurb, and that gives you the general gist of what the state of the galaxy is at the moment, where this book is. So I think all in all, from Light of the Jedi to this, it's between a year to a year and a half, thereabouts. Max has been like 2 years since Light of the Jedi, but with all Star Wars stuff, they give you like a general idea, but they don't like to give explicit dates, especially in the new canon. I'm going to tell you guys now what the event is, and the event in itself, which is on the cover of the 15th issue of the High Republic comics, is what this book is about. It is about a Nile attack on Starlight Beacon. So you can tell that by lots of different pieces, but that's the event in which I'm speaking of. Obviously, Light of the Jedi was the great emergencies, or the great disaster rather, that caused the emergencies. The Rising Storm was the fair on Valo, the Republic fair, being attacked, and this one is Starlight Beacon being attacked. And when I said about the story being quite insular, it's because pretty much all of it takes place on Starlight Beacon. So just before I get into some more in-depth thoughts on this book itself, primarily focusing around the characters and some of the themes, I thought I'd just read you guys the crawl, so the first thing that you read before getting into the book itself. So here it is. The tragic events of the Republic Fair have galvanized the galaxy. The Jedi and the Republic have gone on the offensive to stop the marauding Nihil. With these vicious raiders all but defeated, Jedi Master Avar Kriss has set her sights on Lorna D, the supposed Eye of the Nihil, and has undertaken a mission to capture her once and for all. But unbeknownst to the Jedi, the true leader of the Nihil, the insidious Marchion Ro, is about to launch an attack on the Jedi and the Republic on a scale not seen in centuries. If he succeeds, the Nihil will be triumphant and the light of the Jedi will go dark. Only the brave Jedi Knights of Starlight Beacon stand in his way, but even they may not be enough against Ro and the ancient enemy that's about to be unleashed. So the crawl mentioned Avar Kriss. Now she is one of the central characters of the High Republic, however she features primarily in Cavan Scott's 15-issue comics published under Marvel. So if you want to find out the information about her and what she got up to and how the search for Lorna D kind of ended and things, you can either read the comics, so as I said there are 15 of them, they're on Marvel Unlimited and a few other places as well. I obviously have the physical copies because I love them, but if you don't have the time for that and you want just an abridged version of the plot details and those sort of things, make sure you check out prior episodes of Star Wars Comics in Canon. If you're on YouTube, you can check out the High Republic playlist and they'll be in there, whereas if you're on a podcast app listening on the feed of Comics in Motion, then just check out episodes 84, 88 and 92. So now I'm just going to go through some of the characters that pop up. I'm not going to do any major spoilers of what does or doesn't happen to any of these characters. I'm just going to give you guys bits and pieces of information about them in the really spoilery part of the review right at the end. I'll give a bit more information on certain ones. I don't want to spoil the whole book, but I do want to give you guys enough information. But one of the main characters is Bel Zettifar. Now, he's been a central character for all three of the main adult novels. He was the Padawan of Jedi Master Loden Greatstorm, and he is now the Padawan of Master Indira Stokes. Now, there's a few characters on the cover of The Fallen Star. You should be able to see these on social media, or you can just Google The Fallen Star by Claudia Gray. So I just want to list through the characters that are on the cover, so anyone who's seeing it, you get to see those things. Because for me personally, I'm quite a visual person, so I find that normally when I read these books, especially when there's new characters, I quite like looking at the concept art for the High Republic to get a general gist of what the characters look like, or at least an interpretation of what the characters look like, especially the ones that aren't human, because, you know, some of the weird and wonderful species in Star Wars is not always easy to remember what they look like or even what variations of them would look like. But on the book, from left to right, you've got a character with pale skin, and that is Orla Jareni. You've then got a character near the front with a yellow lightsaber ignited, that is Indira Stokes. Then behind Indira, you've got Bel Zettifar with his green lightsaber. Next to Bel, you've got Buri Yaga, who is also a Padawan, and he's the Padawan to Nib Assek. And then on the right-hand side, you have got Stellan Gios. So obviously all of these characters do appear in this book. As I said, Bel Zettifar is one of the main characters who goes through it. Buri Yaga has been in each book more than the prior one, and I love Buri Yaga as a Wookiee Jedi, and the way that Claudia Gray has written him and how his dialogue is really, really well done. Because instead of it being, you know, quotation marks and then random letters to signify like a Wookiee growl or Shri Wook to be more specific, and then having a character kind of react to that, which is what happens in the comics quite a lot, and it does work, especially with some of the Han Solo and Chewie back and forths. But in this, it's more so written in a way where it's like, Buri Yaga then said that Bel should do this, and then you've got Bel's dialogue saying, oh yeah, Buri, that's a good idea. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing, rather than just having almost wasted page space of having the sound that the Wookiee makes instead of what they're actually saying. So I really liked that addition, and because Buri Yaga is quite a central character to this book particularly, and he shares a lot of page time, like when you say screen time, page time, I guess, with Bel Zettifar. The majority of this book, they are together, and their interactions are brilliant. They're both very intelligent characters. I really like them as Padawans, and seeing them grow over the 3 books has been really, really intriguing and something I've thoroughly enjoyed. So you've got Orla Jareni, who I mentioned before. She is white-skinned, as in pale white, I think chalk white, and she has a double-bladed white lightsaber as well. Now, she is a Wayseeker. She was in Into the Dark, which is Claudia Gray's first novel in the High Republic, and she also appears in the High Republic comics a little bit. She's in like 2 or 3 issues, and she interacts with Keeve Trennis. Now, because she's a Wayseeker, she basically just goes where the Force wills her. She isn't kept in touch with the Jedi's business, the Order, or even really what's going on with the galaxy. She just kind of goes off on her own and figures her way around the galaxy, and then obviously she has friends in the Jedi Order and she does interact with them, and especially when things like this happen where she is needed, she will then interact with them and help where she can. And she interacts with Elzar Mann in this book quite a lot, which I'm going to get into a little bit afterwards, but I'm going to just put that to the side at the moment. So then you've got Stellan Gios. So Stellan Gios, Elzar Mann, and Avar Kriss are like the three main Jedi of these three books, in a sense that the three of them were friends since they were, I think, younglings and definitely Padawans. There's some history there that is friendship and some feelings that is a bit more than friendship. They all have nicknames for each other, but they're all very powerful Jedi Masters that have got a huge amount of respect from their peers. And their interactions over the trilogy of books has been very interesting to watch, especially because Stellan Gios has become a Jedi Council member. So he is a lot more to the book, to the rules, whereas Elzar Mann is a bit more of a wild card, shall we say. He likes to experiment with the Force a bit more. He has got a rebellious streak against authority, and then Avar Kriss is somewhat more aligned with Stellan Gios, but as the books go on, she starts to kind of side more so with Elzar Mann, less following orders, more so going on her own way and doing her own thing. And that causes some friction between her and Stellan Gios. And there's a really interesting, I can't remember if it's a chapter or just a few pages in this book, which mirrors some of the pages in the High Republic comics, because there's a moment where Avar Kriss and Stellan Gios interact, and in the book you get it from Stellan's perspective, whereas in the comics you get it from Avar's perspective. So when I was reading the comics and reading The Fallen Star together, it really, really worked well, and I really, really enjoyed that part. And one fun thing about Stellan Gios is that he sees the Force as stars, and he sees living beings as constellations. Now, every member of the Jedi Order sees the Force in different ways. I believe Elzar Mann sees it as an ocean, which is probably something that I'd say I connect with probably the most. You've got other characters that see it as fire. You've got characters who see it as like gears and mechanical things. Avar sees everything as like songs and music. And it's just, I could read an entire book just listing every Jedi in the history of the High Republic and the Skywalker Saga and just explaining how they perceive the Force. It's one of the most ingenious elements of Star Wars that I'd never even considered was a possibility, and it's one of the things I love the most about the High Republic. It's just, I don't know what it is about it, I just love that interpretation. I love the Force. It's my favorite thing about Star Wars, and any interpretations of the Force, any new Force powers, any beings that can use the Force unexpectedly, which I will get onto as well later on. It's just something that I really think was not quite lacking for the Skywalker Saga necessarily, but more so in the expanded content, so in some of the comics and some of the books. For me, there wasn't quite enough going into the Force and going into the minutiae of that. I'd say one of the best examples to find out information about the Force is actually in the Clone Wars. It's season 6, I think it's the last 4 episodes, and it's the Yoda arc, where he goes on a journey, he meets some Force beings, he speaks with Qui-Gon, he finds out how to be a Force ghost, all those things. It's really, really interesting. But yeah, I think the High Republic does it in such an incredible way. And Stellan Gios at this time is kind of like the poster child, especially after what happened on Valo, which happened in The Rising Storm. Stellan is just, he's so following the rules of the Order, and he does actually somewhat struggle with this. More towards the end of the book, he kind of has a realization that he's only really been doing what the Order's ever told him to do, and he kind of questions whether or not he's even a good person necessarily, because he's just been doing what people have told him to do. He doesn't really have agency, which is a really interesting idea. And one of the themes that comes across in this book quite a lot is the Jedi, their power, but also duty. And these elements of an individual do not define who that individual is. Because I think with the prequel era Jedi especially, a lot of it is you are a Jedi and that's your personality in essence. There's some Jedi that have slightly different opinions on that. You know, Quinlan Vos is like a maverick. He's someone who does brush a lot of Jedi the wrong way, including Obi-Wan, but he's a very interesting character, but he still follows the rules quite a lot. Quinlan Vos is probably the character that follows the rules the least in the prequel era Jedi, but the rest of them are very much to the book, and that's one of the reasons that the Jedi of the prequel era fell, and that's what the High Republic is meant to show, is how they went from the more sort of loose, chilled out Jedi to the more dogmatic, specific Jedi, and how that kind of changes so many elements of how they interact with the wider galaxy. And the element of duty is something that I think transcends Star Wars, because everyone has some degree of duty, whether or not it's duty to your family, to your job, to your friends, any elements of that. Obviously, duty is important, especially if you have children, then I would say that your children should be the number one priority for you. Your duty is to provide for them, to care for them and things. But excluding children, which is quite a more cemented, more obvious thing, thinking about job, it's really something that I'm always tussling with. I'm always thinking, you know, how much time should I be investing into my career? How much into podcasting? How much into just other elements of my life? Trying to find that balance of living and having to survive, which is why I have a job to make money, but doing the things that I'm passionate about, like this podcast and, my other show, Genuine Chit-Chat, and interacting with other podcasters and things. There's so many different levels to what duty could connect to, and I think that the themes within this book, Claudia Gray puts across expertly. It's a really, really good insight into that, and it really shows what one can perceive when they, what lessons one can learn from Star Wars, because Star Wars teaches a whole lot of lessons, be it the original trilogy, the prequels, any of those things, or any book. There's always like a moral story or fiber, that comes from mythology, and that's what mythology is just meant for. It's meant to tell stories, to teach lessons. That's in essence what it's for. And Star Wars is just a modern mythology framed in a way that it's pure fiction, when obviously I'm not saying the Force and the Jedi aren't fictional, but the mythological side of storytelling is slightly different to the purely fictitious in some ways. I'm kind of rambling here on that element, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of mythology, but I've spoken about that, I think, with my friend Ben on Star Wars Timeline. So if you want to find out more about those things, go and check out Star Wars Timeline, the YouTube channel, because, there's lots of interesting conversations about mythology, some with me, some without, so, check that out. So aside from those characters, you've got Marchion Ro, who's obviously a central character. He was mentioned in The Crawl. He is the Eye of the Nile. He's been in all of the High Republic books. He has been, all the High Republic adult books. He's not really been in the High Republic main run, the comic run by Marvel written by Kevin Scott. He's not been in that very much, but in the High Republic Adventures comics, for the first half of them, he was featured in it a lot. He interacted with a character called Crix, so I've tackled that on Star Wars Comics in Canon as well, so make sure you check those out. Those were by IDW Publishing, so they're technically okay for all ages, but I still think, regardless of that, they are brilliant. Don't let the fact that they are appropriate for all ages dissuade you from purchasing them or reading them, because they are excellent. They've got incredible artwork and brilliant stories, and Marchion Ro is in it quite a lot. And in this, you kind of get to see what happens when Marchion Ro's plans all, like everything he's been building towards. That's basically what this trilogy of books is about. On the flip side, you get to see who the Nile are and how they interact with each other behind the scenes, but also how Marchion Ro is using the Nile for his own gain, or how he perceives people and things. There's the 2-part comic, which is Eye of the Storm, which is written by Charles Soule. I am going to be tackling that very soon. I don't know if I'm going to do it next week. I haven't thought that far ahead specifically, but I'm going to be doing the High Republic Adventures finale, the Eye of the Storm, which is set after Fallen Star, and some other High Republic content to kind of wrap up phase 1. But in the first issue, you actually get to see from Marchion Ro's perspective and how he sees people. And I'm not going to go into it here, but it's just a very intriguing look. He's a very interesting character and definitely a very interesting antagonist. And I'm interested to see where he goes from this book. But, I'll get into that later on in the review. But it shows of his, planning. It shows that he's got this assistant. It shows that he's been manipulative. He just seemingly sees people as tools. He has a very similar mindset to what Palpatine does with people, where everyone is just a tool for you to use, and once they've ceased being useful, you just get rid of them. And that's what Marchion Ro is all about, and that's why the plan that he has in this, how it works so well, and how so many of his attacks on the Republic have worked so well. So he's a brilliant villain. I think that all the High Republic authors kind of thought about him, but I know that Charles Soule, I feel like he said somewhere that he was either the creator of Marchion Ro, or that he's had a huge amount of influence into Marchion Ro. Obviously, he wrote Light of the Jedi, which is when Marchion Ro first appeared, and he's writing Eye of the Storm, which is kind of like the origin story of Marchion Ro. I've just said his name so many times. But he's a really, really good antagonist, and in this, I think he gets the most amount of page time, I believe. You do get quite a bit of it in the Tempest Runner audio drama by Kevin Scott that centers around Lorna Dee, and I would recommend that as well if you want to find out about Marchion Ro. But the main things would be these 3 books, the High Republic Adventures comics, Tempest Runner, and then the Eye of the Storm comics. So the next main character is probably the last of the main characters, then I'll get onto a couple of the side characters. You got Elzar Mann, and he's been struggling with the dark side, and I'll go into a little bit more about him slightly later, but he's obviously the other part of the 3, him, Avar Kriss, and Stellan Gios, and he is probably my favourite character in the High Republic, I think. I very much enjoy it when you have characters who struggle. One of the reasons I've always had an issue with Superman, and granted I've not read many Superman comics, so this is purely on Superman as a character portrayed in movies and the TV show and things, is he's just infallible. He's just this unbelievably, perfectly good person, and that's that. Now, I know Captain America does have that element to him as well, but for me, Captain America has, because he's not essentially a god, he has a lot more weight to him. He can be killed by a gunshot, and because of what happens with Captain America in Civil War, he has a bit more of that rebellious streak. So he's not just a goody-goody who follows the rules and also is infallible. Whereas Superman follows the rules and also is infallible. Whereas Elzar Mann in this, for me, he's much more complex because no one is all good and no one is all bad. I mean, well, I say no one is all bad. There are probably people out there who are purely bad. I don't know about the word term evil. I'm not going to get into good and evil here. But, you know, with intent, there are characters in this who struggle with being good. There's characters in this that actually struggle with being bad, like Nan. There's an interesting character. But Elzar Mann is someone who's trying to be good, but keeps being pulled to the dark side for one reason or another. He first kind of tangles with it in The Rising Storm, and him doing that saved lots of people's lives. So it's that kind of slope element of it. You know, you see it with Anakin in the Clone Wars series, where he keeps doing or using dark side abilities, and then he gets a positive, in air quotes, light side outcome. You know, he ends up, I think, force choking and like torturing Poggle the Lesser, and he gets information out which saves hundreds of people's lives. Well, obviously, that's the idea of the ends justify the means, where you do something bad, but it's a net good, so it's okay. And that's something which I don't think that the prequels really tackled that well. I think the Clone Wars did a very good job of showing the balance there, but one criticism that I understand from especially Revenge of the Sith is it just seems like Anakin's all good and then suddenly he's bad. You know, you get a bit of it in Attack of the Clones where he kills the Tusken Raiders, but aside from that, there's not really that much. Whereas I think Elzar Mann is probably meant to be like a vague parallel to him. I know that some of the High Republic authors have kind of mentioned that it's meant to show that if someone did tangle with the dark side in the High Republic era, they would have so much more of a support system. They would be able to bring themselves out of it rather than just plummeting to the dark side and doing what Anakin did. So I really, really like Elzar Mann with that. And the start of this book, like the first couple of chapters, is him on an ocean world with Orla Jareni, and he's trying to learn to kind of rebuild his connection to the Force. He's closed himself off from the Force because he's too scared of using dark side abilities and hurting people and doing the wrong thing. So he completely closes himself off from the Force, and then he learns from Orla to connect himself in a much more reduced way, in a more controlled way, but also realizing that, you know, he has this perception of the Force like an ocean, and there's some very interesting meditative techniques that he uses, or that Orla lets him use, where he's like doing a handstand as the tide comes in on this ocean planet, and he has to learn that he can't force the ocean or the tide to do anything. He has to go with it for it to help, otherwise it will get you, in essence. Like, that's it's over several chapters, and it's very expertly written. It's one of my favourite parts, if not my favourite part of the whole book, but it's just so well done. I really, really appreciate a character that is struggling, because although I've never done anything inherently evil or bad, you know, there are moments where you do something, either you argue with someone you care about, or you say something kind of dickish at work or anything like that, and then afterwards you're kind of thinking to yourself, was that the right thing to do? Am I a good person? Those sorts of thoughts come to your mind. And obviously most of the time, if you are contemplating whether or not you are a good person, you probably are a good person, because generally speaking, if you're not a very good person, you wouldn't have the introspection to even consider whether or not what you were doing is right or wrong, in general. You know, very broad strokes here. But yeah, I very much connect with characters like that, and Elzar Mann is definitely one of those characters. And yeah, any time he's in it, I really like reading about it, and having a Jedi who is struggling with their connection to the Force and is trying to find balance while there's this big event that's going on. You know, I mentioned earlier, Starlight Beacon, he gets attacked by the Nile. While he's trying to deal with that, while also having his own inner turmoil, which he's only just literally gone back from a retreat, basically being like, okay, I think I can take it easy now and figure out who I am and what to do. He then gets thrown in the deep end at this, you know, critical emergency situation, and seeing how he handles that is very interesting. And I just really like it. Him and his interactions with Stellan Gios in particular really balance him and Stellan out as characters, and I love those interactions. And that's something that Claudia Gray does expertly. She's very, very good with characters and dialogue and how they interact. So that leads us onto some of the side characters. So you've got Coley Lynn, who is just, I wrote down here, he's an asshat, because I try not to swear on my Star Wars show. I would call him many other things, but I don't want to spoil this being one of the only explicit Star Wars podcasts that I do. He is just an awful person. He is untrustworthy. He's a liar. He's a backstabber, and he's just an unpleasant person. So I thought I'd throw that in there, that I hate him, and kudos to Claudia Gray for introducing me to a character within a few chapters, and I immediately hate them. The way that Claudia writes it, especially when there's certain moments from his perspective and how he sees himself against others, it really cements the fact that you don't like him. But Some of the characters that really interact with Coley are three of my other favourite characters from the High Republic era, which I bow down to Claudia Gray because I think she somewhat created these characters. And you've got Affy Hollow, Leox Gyasi, and Geode. So they were introduced in Into the Dark. They were also in the Out of the Shadows book, which is the last book review that I did. And obviously they're in this book now. So they went from young adult to another young adult to main adult. So I really like the fact they're, continuing trajectory, and then they were in the 3 books because I really, really enjoy reading them. Affy is just a good, interesting character, a young woman trying to find her place in the universe. You got Leox, who is just amazing. He's funny, he's good-hearted, he often smokes a bit of spice, so I think the on-the-nose thing there is he's basically the equivalent of like a stoner. So he's a bit of a stoner in certain ways, but he's very switched on, he's very intelligent, but he's quite chill with a lot of stuff, he's quite lax in certain elements, but when emergency situations occur, he is someone you can heavily rely on and depend on, which makes him such a compelling character. And then you get Geode. So Geode is a Vintian, so he's basically just a big rock, and he's in the High Republic comics as well. In fact, Leox, Affy, and Geode are all in one arc of the High Republic Adventures comics by IDW. I believe I tackled them a few episodes ago. It was the 2nd volume of High Republic Adventures that they're in, and I just love seeing them in all ways. Geode being basically a giant rock, and people don't even know if he's really alive or if he even does anything. And when you are first introduced to him, especially in Into the Dark, you are thinking that. You're like, is he alive? Is he doing anything? And then once you realize he is, and you understand him, and the way Claudia Gray writes him once again is so well done. He has such a personality for basically a rock who has no dialogue. The way she does it, it's just excellent, and there's a lot of comedy to it as well, especially when you get characters who don't understand. You get in the High Republic Adventures comics, there's a point where like pirates try and take over the ship, and then one of them turns around and is like, how did that rock get there? Where did it come from? And it's that humor that characters not knowing who or what Vintians are, it just adds so much. I love Geode, and I think Geode was one of those characters that a lot of the High Republic authors kind of knew when they were creating the High Republic, or the High Republic architects, I should say. Charles Soule, Cavan Scott, Claudia Gray, Justina Ireland, and Daniel Jose Older are the primary ones. And I think it's Michael Siglain as well. He's not an explicit writer, but I think he was one of the story group editors that helped put it all together. A lot of them are saying, like, when they were writing Geode, they would really hope a lot of fans would respond to him, but you never really know. There's certain characters that fans don't respond to as much, which you thought they would respond to, and vice versa. And Geode is one of the highlights. I love Geode so much. He's such a cool character. And then the only other side characters I think are worth mentioning in this review is Nan and Chancey Yarrow. So Nan appears first in Into the Dark. She is a Nihil character. You don't know she's Nihil till right at the end. She has interactions with Rhys Silas, and then she also appears again in Out of the Shadows. This works really well, my Out of the Shadows being the last review, because this book heavily connects Into the Dark and Out of the Shadows. But the other character is Chancey Yarrow. So she is the mother of the character in Out of the Shadows, the main character, and that character's name is Silvestri Yarrow, and she's on the cover of Out of the Shadows along with Vanessa Rowe and also Rhys Silas, who neither of those appear in this book. But Chancey Yarrow is someone who doesn't work for the Nihil. She works for basically herself and has done work for the Nihil for her own gain. Nan, however, was a Nihil, and then she somewhat kind of defected to work with Chancey Yarrow, and in this whole book she is constantly fighting with herself, trying to work out whether or not she wants to be with the Nihil, or if she wants to be her own person, if she wants to go in the galaxy with Chancey after what it is they're doing is done, or where she wants to fall. So she is kind of the flip side. She is not like Elzar, who's someone who's good, who is pulling to the darkness but is trying to keep themselves light. She is someone who's out for herself. She just doesn't really care morally. She's willing to kill people and do this and do that, but she's just trying to work out what she even really wants. There's parts of her that want to just bow down to Marchion Ro, and there's other parts of her that want to run away and be her own person, and I just think her character's written really well, and her interactions with the Chancey works really well too. So as I sort of wrap up this midway review, as in the slight spoilers, I've spoken about some of the characters and the themes and highlighted some of the journeys and whatnot. There's a few other themes I just wanted to mention. One of which is, I already mentioned the Jedi and power and duty doesn't define who you are. I've also got written down that one needs to learn to let go when necessary, while simultaneously not give up at the wrong moments. So it's really just have faith in yourself. There's certain times where you try for something and it just isn't working clearly, so it's time to leave it and go do something else in essence. While simultaneously, there are times where if you're being too hard on yourself and you can't succeed, if you just give yourself that final push, you can really overcome a lot. So I like that. Another element is friendship and found family, as well as the hollow nature of selfishness. That's highlighted in Coley Lynn, as the character I said earlier that I dislike hugely, and they are like a nemesis of Leox, Gyasi, and the vessel crew. So I really like that element. Friendship and found family is a massive theme in pretty much all of Star Wars, and so it's very important to incredible amount of individuals, whether or not you have a positive relationship with your blood-related family or your adoptive family or anything like that. People still know that your friends are basically your family that you choose to surround yourself with, and it needs to be noted that even whether they're family who are related to you by blood or otherwise, or even if they're friends of yours, if they are no longer bringing benefit to you or they're being mean to you and there's something that they are like causing more damage to your life, you don't have to have them in your life. There's no reason for that. So I think that's an element of Star Wars that I really, really appreciate. And then another element is sort of unity, but this is more unity of a nation, of a religion, of a republic. It's people specifically. The importance of, although as an individual you may not seem powerful, but when you have groups of people getting together and working together, you can achieve incredible feats, be it in like a theoretical or metaphysical way, just being good, supporting people, those sort of things, like an emotional way, or actually physically saying, we're going to achieve this thing, we're going to build something, or we're going to repair something. There's varying degrees of what unity and achievement can be. And I think that this really works because in this story, there is a system nearby to where Starlight Beacon gets attacked, and they want to help Starlight. Now, Starlight is nearby the system. It's called Iram, E-I-R-A-M, Iram. Starlight being near Iram, it's trying to help them, it's doing relief efforts, and then when the Nihil attack, then it kind of the roles flip in a sense. So Iram then can choose to help Starlight. And there's a lot of conversations that the two queens of Iram, well, the queen and the queen regent, I think it's called. Basically, there's the queen who's elected in the standard means, and then a woman who married the queen who becomes, I think it's the queen regent, something like that. Someone who has similar power to the queen, but not quite as much. And you get these two characters who were in Into the Dark once again, because Orla Jareni and Master Comac Vitus, they have flashbacks, which is an interaction with Queen Thandeka, I think her name is off the top of my head, and she is a character who is, well, she's the queen of Iram, and therefore when Starlight is in crisis and there's certain elements and certain decisions that have to be made, you've got Thandeka and her partner trying to work out what the best thing to do is, and whether or not it's best to do this for this people or for those people, and what a good leader needs to do. And I think that's just another element of this book that I really appreciate, another theme that's very important, which is something that, in Star Wars, the politics of Star Wars is quite a hot topic, because there's a lot of politics in all Star Wars, including the original trilogy, but obviously in the prequels they are very heavy-handed with it, and then the sequels they're very light-handed with it, and they don't really mention it very much. So it's this kind of weird thing across the three trilogies of varying degrees of politics being spoken about. And I think that the way it is written in The Fallen Star is just very well put together. It doesn't feel heavy-handed. There's not loads and loads of politics, but there's a sprinkling of it, and there's intrigue into it, which is, I think, really what the original trilogy had. You have those conversations, you have those moments where they talk about the current political state of the galaxy without, having a Senate meeting and listening to people talk for like 10 minutes about trade disputes. There are definitely reasons why the prequels are quite hotly criticized for their portrayal of politics, but this book does not have any of that. It just has what I think is quintessential political discussions in this, and I really appreciate it. So now the last part of the middle review is, these are slightly more spoilery, so this kind of bleeds into my final review. So if everything I've said is all you want to know about the book, then, pause this, go read the book or listen to the audiobook. It's brilliant, and then come back and listen to the last part. But this is now going to be me primarily talking about some of the plot information and more hot spoilery parts. But the reason I say this is kind of in between them somewhat is because this is just 3 tidbits of information that I picked up, that I wrote, that I think is quite interesting, that I enjoyed picking up when reading this. So one of them is something I already mentioned earlier, which is with the character Orla Jareni, and that is that Wayseekers are kept out of Jedi and Council business. So you know about Wayseekers a little bit. I think in Into the Dark, when Orla Jareni is introduced, she is introduced as a Wayseeker, and you don't really know that much about them, just they kind of get to do their own thing. And this book, it goes into more detail of what Wayseekers can actually do, and you get a piece of that puzzle in the High Republic comics that Orla Jareni appears in as well. I think she appears in issues somewhere between 9 and 12. I think it's 10 and 11, but I might be wrong there, or maybe 9 and 10. I'm doing it off the top of my head, that element of it. But it was intriguing to hear that Wayseekers are not only sort of going around doing their own thing, but they're actually kept at arm's length of Jedi business. And Orla and Stellan Gios have some history, not romantic history or anything, they're friendship history, but they had like a a falling out in some ways, because Stellan doesn't really like Wayseekers very much, and Orla doesn't really like the Council very much. So you do get some interactions between them that I really like, and you get to find out more about Wayseekers, because they're a sect of the Jedi Order that I'd be very intrigued to hear more about. Another part is the triangle between Avar Kriss, Elzar Mann, and Stellan Gios. And we already know that Elzar Mann has some feelings to Avar Kriss because it is mentioned in The Rising Storm. And then we know to some degree that Avar Kriss, they had something between them. There was something, seemingly when they were Padawans or something along those lines, that there was potentially something physical between them, because Elzar Mann has like a flashback, a thought. I'm pretty certain it's in The Rising Storm. It might be in this book, but I think it's Rising Storm, where he has some sort of flash and he remembers kind of opening his eyes and laying in a bed with Avar Kriss. And I think they're holding hands when this happens. So it alludes to, you know, a physical relationship there in some degree. But one of the reasons I'm mentioning it here is because there's a moment where Avar does think about Elzar Mann, but she tries to dismiss these thoughts. It's in the middle of her dealing with a crisis, and she can't really think about Elzar Mann, but he kind of seeps into her mind. And that's one of the first times you really get an idea that Avar is still thinking about him in that way today. In prior times with Avar, you just get the impression that she's completely over it, and it's just Elzar who's kind of holding on to this relationship we're still not fully sure of what it actually was. And so I really like the fact that it's only a line or two where you just get the knowledge that Avar still thinks about Elzar a little bit. I really like. Then the other little tidbit is linking in with what I've just said, which is Padawans are known to fool around with each other. So without getting into any explicit detail, you know, when people have a physical relationship, shall we say, you know, in a sexual sense, when that happens, it happens in the Jedi Order. So Padawans were known to have that with each other, and most of the people, especially the Masters, pretended not to notice usually, because it's somewhat expected at that age, Padawans, when you're teenagers and things. But then if it goes too far, if people become too entangled, then normally what would happen is that a Padawan gets taken away on a long mission, and then when the Padawan comes back, the two Padawans who are somewhat entangled are normally just over it, and then everything goes back to normal. And obviously, when they do that, they generally gain some perspective and things, and they grow up. So that was quite an interesting part that I enjoyed, because in the prequels, you're basically told that any relationship at all is bad, and that's one of the reasons that Anakin falls to the dark side. Whereas in this, it shows that, no, they knew it happened. They knew teenagers are going to fool around, even if you're in like this religion. It's highly and strongly alluded to that you have to be celibate in the Jedi Order. They don't explicitly say that, but from the interactions with certain characters, it's pretty obvious that's the case. Especially when you get a character like Rael Averross, who I absolutely love. He's a character in the Master and Apprentice book by Claudia Gray, and he has sex. And I really like that Claudia Gray does actually tackle matters that are of a sexual nature in Star Wars without it being gratuitous and unnecessary. But sex is a large part of human interaction for most people's lives. You know, when you become an adult, especially when you want to have a relationship with someone, and obviously when you want to have children, that is a part of it. And although I don't want there to be loads of sex in Star Wars, it's nice to see when it is just lightly alluded to, or when you get a little bit of information about it, of how the Jedi, at least in the High Republic era, tackled that element, especially when you have teenagers who are just full of hormones. And anyone who's been a teenager, which I assume is pretty much everyone who's listening, and anyone who has kids who are teenagers, you know how much of a handful they can be when that starts to occur. So that's about going to do it for my middle part review, and now I'm going to get into the full spoiler review of this part. I'm not going to speak too much here because I've kind of said everything I think about the book. There's just really, I'm going to talk about the ending a little bit, and then some of the characters who did not make it. So this is your spoiler warning. I would recommend that if you've listened to all the other stuff I've done, that's fine. You can still read Fallen Star. I will not spoil everything, but I will say that you listening to this next part is probably going to take away a fair amount from your enjoyment of Fallen Star if you haven't already embarked on that. So you get certain characters that pop up and die, which is quite upsetting to me. One of them is Orla Jareni dying, and that is probably one of the worst parts because she was such an intriguing character to me. I absolutely loved her. You got introduced to a new character called Reginald Cole, who I really liked, and I thought he was really cool, and he was a Jedi with a sense of humour, and then within a few chapters of getting introduced to him, he's dead, which was very upsetting to me as well. I know obviously in this, it was certain characters were going to die. There was going to be a lot of them that die, and some were going to be major characters, some were going to be minor characters. You get the creature going around, which was the Leveler, which is this force-sensitive being that well, it's not force sensitive. It seemingly is the opposite of that. It's kind of like there's these creatures in Legends, I think in the Heir to the Empire trilogy that I think George Lucas didn't like very much. Century or something. I can't remember their exact names because I'm not as well into Legends as everyone else seems to be, aside from me. I'm trying. I've read Plagueis and Shatterpoint. I'm reading the Darth Bane trilogy now. I'm going to read Heir to the Empire soon as well and read some other comics. But there's this creature that doesn't have... You can't detect them in the Force, and they can even release out like a Force bubble so that you can't use the Force around them and things like that. And these creatures, the levelers, are kind of a level up from that. They're these ancient beings that suck the life out and the Force energy out of Force users. And when you get characters like Skier interact with them, which happens in the High Republic comics, he has lost his connection to the Force, so he is relatively unaffected by the levelers. And this is one of the reasons why Elzar Mann works so well in this book, because he has to navigate Starlight Beacon under attack, both by the Nile as like, explosive devices and trying to destroy it, but also with the levelers on there, which are like sapping Force energy, either directly from people and killing them or near killing them, or just them being on board the beacon. It is hugely affecting the Jedi's abilities to connect with the Force and think clearly. There's a moment where Bel Zettifar, he leaves Starlight Beacon and he immediately feels like all his Force energies come back, and he was like, oh, I didn't even realize how much I was being sapped my Force energy until I got off, which is something that's really interesting. I like that concept. I hope they didn't use the levelers necessarily too much. I think when you saw them in the comics, some of the visuals of it was absolutely stunning. I really recommend, if anyone just can pick up High Republic number 15, I think it was, you just get to see what they kind of look like and what they do to people in that. It is intense, trying to explain that. I can imagine it was really difficult for the comic book artists to kind of put pen to paper to show what that would look like, because they're almost just nightmare fuel, and they seem to differ depending on who is affected by the levelers. But so many characters get killed. I'm not going to just list them all, but there is a major character that gets killed right near the end. And when I spoke to Kevin Scott, he said that there was a character that they weren't actually going to kill initially, but then they changed their mind and they decided to kill them at the end of this. And so this is the major spoiler, and that is that Stellan Gios dies. And that was something which I don't know how I feel about that, because I really, really liked the interactions between Avar, Elzar and Stellan. I really liked that, and it's sad to see a character like that go, especially when he starts to kind of find himself towards the end. But, you can't have stories like that stakes. We got Loden Greatstorm, who's one of the coolest Jedi ever, immediately get killed. Well, not immediately. Who dies, in Rising Storm, but he gets taken away from us far too soon. But then that's the brilliance of a good storyteller. They introduce you to a character who's brilliant, and then they take him away from you, and it's very sad. So there are a bunch of other characters that kind of meet their end or don't meet their end. I'm not going to spoil or go through them all. But I think the way the book ended, it was really good. When you find out partway through the book that parts of Starlight split off, and that's when the comics kind of end, because you see Avar Kriss is in one part of Starlight Beacon and then it splits, and you then see the rest of Starlight Beacon, like what happens to that, and you see how the Queen Thandeka on Iram, they have the option to shoot down Starlight Beacon and kill everyone on board but save their people, and Stellan Gios sacrifice himself to make sure that the crashing of Starlight Beacon doesn't hit a main city, it goes into the water, and then from that it means that the casualty levels are reduced a huge amount. I think it went from like thousands of people potentially dying to like a dozen. I think that's what one of the droids said. But it did give the book a lot more weight. There was a lot of people that died, and I think that when you get to Phase 3 of the High Republic, obviously we've got Phase 2 coming up, which is going to be going back 150 years, and then Phase 3 is going to be set after this Phase 1. We're going to see, hopefully it's going to be a bit of a time jump, and then we're going to see like how certain characters interact with each other after this, because the Nile are still out there. Marchion Ro ends the book by announcing himself and telling everyone that he's responsible for everything the Nile have done over the 3 books. And you just think, what's up next? What are the Jedi? How are they going to interact? What's going to make the Jedi become so much more dogmatic as you see them in the Skywalker saga? What is Elzar Mann? Is he going to leave the Jedi Order? Is he going to fall more into the dark side? How is it that what the Nile have done are going to affect people? Because Avar in the comics was really affected. She kind of danced with the dark side a little bit as well. She almost kills Lorna D when she's unarmed, which for me, I would have killed her 100%. I'm like, Yeah, I'm obviously not a Jedi. I'd have the dark side or the light side powers and stuff. But if there's a war criminal, I would have killed her. So, take that with what you will. I'm not necessarily going to delve into any of my opinions on things like the death sentence, because that's something I do not want to touch, because that is such a complicated issue. But in the realms of fiction, and when you see what a character like Lorna D has done, how many chances they've had, and what they do after not being killed, you then, for me, I was like, oh yeah, if you'd have killed them, hindsight, this bad thing wouldn't have happened, sort of thing. But I'm just intrigued to see how the events of this are going to affect the Jedi going forward, and how it's going to change the galaxy. And also what the Nihil are going to do. I assume the Levelers are going to be quite a big part of it. Even though I don't necessarily want them to be a huge part of it, I feel like they are necessary for Marchion Ro. I think he wants to exterminate the Jedi, and I don't really see how he's going to do that very well without these Leveler creatures. Hopefully it's given me some more cool, weird Force artifacts I'm intrigued by, but we shall see about that. But, there's other elements of this story that happen, but a lot of it is kind of getting the vague gist is just the Nihil bomb Starlight Beacon from the inside, then they let off these Levelers that go around causing havoc to the Jedi. The Starlight Beacon splits in half, and one of the parts of it manages to kind of escape a bit and not crash, and the other half of it starts to crash, but bits and pieces are falling apart, and Stellan Gios and Elzar and Buriaga and Belzetafar are desperately trying to return power to certain parts of the Starlight, and then help the people aboard, get people evacuated, all these different elements of things to try and reduce the casualty amount to as low as possible, and trying to make sure that the nearby planet of Iriam isn't basically bombed by a giant space station, because that would be cataclysmic. So I don't want to just go here and list off everything that happens to all of the characters. You've got Nan and Chancey Yarrow and how their kind of story unfolds, as well as Buriaga and Bells. There's so many elements of it I really, really enjoy, but I also want to talk about the ending and Marchion Ro and what it means for the future, less so than just be like, okay guys, rub my hands together, here's the whole plot of The Fallen Star, because I don't really want to do that. So with that, I think it's probably quite a good place to end this and wrap it up. We're well over an hour now, so I try and keep these to around an hour, because, who wants to listen to someone talk about a book that probably takes you 10 hours to read, but listen to an hour of someone talking about that? Clearly quite a lot of you do, because these episodes I release are fairly popular, so thank you so much for listening to these. I do hugely appreciate it. But what have we got coming up then over the coming weeks? What's going on, really? Well, obviously, there's going to be another batch of the Poe Dameron comics I'm going to be tackling. I only have another 2 or 3 volumes of those to do, and then I've caught up with all of those. And then there's the other High Republic content, so I'm going to do, I think, High Republic Adventures, the final issues of that. Then there's also Trail of Shadows, which the end of that minor spoilers for the High Republic Adventures, so I'm going to do that after that. Eye of the Storm, the 2-part comic series, I don't know when I'm going to do that. I've read the first one and I've got the second one, but I didn't want to read the second one until I'd done the Fallen Star book review, because I get distracted. So I'm going to read that and see how that goes. Obviously, where it's only 2 comics, although they're bigger comics, it's slightly less work for me to release an episode. So either I'm going to be lazy and basically choose it on a week that I'm really busy and then release that, or I'm going to choose the optimum time to release that. I'm not 100% sure. So we've got those High Republic pieces of content out. Then there's also going to be The Edge of Balance Volume 2. That's coming out in May. And then I'm going to do, I think, one episode just about both of those volumes of The Edge of Balance kind of put together. So, because I read Edge of Balance Part 1 and I did enjoy it, but I think that I could probably do 2 of those in one episode. I may change my mind when I come down to it. We shall see. But I'm going to try and focus on the High Republic stuff, so it's all kind of finished and done. Then I can focus on a lot of the Crimson Reign comics and some of the other miniseries that's coming out. We've got the Obi-Wan Kenobi comics that have started coming, or which are coming out soon. I think they come out around the time the Kenobi series comes out. We've got the Han Solo and Chewbacca comics. We've got the Halcyon Legacy miniseries. We've got, the Crimson Reign comics as well, which is like the main runs that are going on at the moment. And then in October, we're going to have the High Republic Phase 2 coming out, which I'm very, very excited for. But I'll also make sure that over the coming weeks or /months, I'm going to do book reviews on Mission to Disaster and also Midnight Horizon, which are the other 2 books in the 3rd wave of the first phase of the High Republic. I haven't read them yet. I don't even own them yet. I obviously have been on holiday to Malta, and I've been very busy with me and Megan are sorting out, hopefully getting a house, obviously doing book reviews and podcasts and all these other things. I haven't had full amount of time, but as soon as payday comes around, which is about a week after this podcast airs, I'm then going to buy Mission to Disaster. I'll do the review of that, and then shortly after that, I'll buy Midnight Horizon. And then obviously in addition to that, we've got other Star Wars books coming out. We've got Brotherhood, we've got Padawan, we've got Shadows of the Sith. There's the Queen's, the third of the Queen's trilogy, but I've not read Queen's Hope or Queen's Shadow, so I'm probably not really going to delve into that. It's not something that hugely intrigues me, but plenty of other books coming out that I may do reviews for those on here, but I may do reviews for them on my Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/genuine chit-chat, for as little as £1 a month, you can support the show, you can support all the books I buy, all the comics that I buy, and all of those elements and all the time that I invest into that. But you don't just support the show, you also get hours and hours of additional content, some Star Wars related, some not Star Wars related. So I've been doing some Star Wars book reviews. I've done reviews for Shatterpoint and Darth Plagueis, which are both Legends books. I've done it for A New Dawn, which is the prequel book to Star Wars Rebels. It shows how Hera Syndulla and Kanan Jarrus met. I did Last Shot, which is also by Daniel Jose Older. That's about Lando and Han about 5 or 10 years after Return of the Jedi, I think it was. And then I also have done Dark Disciple, which is by Christy Golden, and that is about Asajj Ventress and Quinlan Vos in the tail end of the Clone Wars. The book was written from unused Clone Wars scripts. So it was meant to be in the Clone Wars. I'm very sad it wasn't, but the book is ace, and the audiobook is also brilliant as well. So if you want to hear my reviews on those, they're not quite as long as this, they're not as structured as these ones, but I generally give my thoughts without spoiling it, and then I go into slightly more spoilery stuff, but they are generally about half an hour long each. So obviously there's 5 of those out at the moment. I'm currently listening to the first of the Darth Bane audiobooks. So Darth Bane is obviously a very important Sith in Legends, and he's actually in canon because he's in the Clone Wars. The arc that I mentioned earlier with Yoda, where he goes on this Force journey, he does go to a Sith temple on Moraban, which is basically just Korriban. They're the same place. And he interacts with like this artifact that has been like imbued with like a curse that has like an ethereal spirit of Darth Bane. I'm massacring what happens in that episode, but if you don't know anything about Darth Bane and you want to know about stuff in the canon, he basically created the Rule of Two, which is what the Sith adhere to by the Skywalker Saga, because they've been hiding in the shadows for like 1,000 years since the ancient Sith Wars and stuff. But reading in Legends, you get a lot more details about it. Obviously, it's where they all kind of came from. So I'm very interested by that. So I'm releasing a lot of all my Legends content, like reviews and things. That's all going to be on my Patreon. And then just non-High Republic books, I think, are all going to be on there as well. Because I think with all the High Republic stuff coming out, I think it's a good place to put them on this channel. Regarding Brotherhood, which is the Obi-Wan and Anakin book, which is set right at the start of Clone Wars, I believe. I think that's where Anakin's going to get knighted. I'm pretty sure that's what the book is going to be, by Mike Chen. I think that either has just come out or it's coming out very soon. I'm very interested by that, but I don't think I'll be doing a full book review on this channel. I'll just stick to High Republic stuff because I've got a lot of things to do there, and then I've obviously got IDW stuff, Star Wars Adventures comics, Tales of Vader's Castle. I've got 2 more batches of those to do, so lots of other things to do. But on my Patreon, as well as those book reviews, I also do an afterthought show with my girlfriend Megan. We obviously went to Malta recently. We did a 40-minute podcast about Malta that I just uploaded. So if you want to hear about our travels in Malta and stuff, and you want to know a bit more about me when I'm not talking about Star Wars or talking to guests on Genuine Chit-Chat, you just want to hear what I am like to talk to outside of podcasting, it's basically the same, then you can check that out. You can find out what me and Megan are up to. And we also do movie reviews. We're doing a Tom Hanks rewatch at the moment, we're doing a watch of Tom Hanks movies. So we started with Big. So we did Big, The Burbs, Turner and Hooch, Joe versus the Volcano. We've just done Sleepless in Seattle and A League of Their Own. Sleepless in Seattle will be uploaded in a week or so. So we're going through Tom Hanks movies. Then we've got Philadelphia and Forrest Gump coming up as well. And we'll be doing Toy Story and Apollo 13 and lots of those other movies. Basically all the way up to modern Tom Hanks. I think we need to go back and do a couple of older ones as well, like Splash and the Money Pit that we missed. But if you want to hear a couple of people talk about movies that they haven't seen, and we also do MCU movies, we go to the cinema and watch stuff, and we do spoiler-free reviews of those as well as we do watch some random older movies too. We watched Rent the other day, which I hadn't seen, so I'm planning on doing a review on that too. So if you want Star Wars book reviews that aren't on this channel, if you want Star Wars Legends book reviews that aren't on this channel, if you want movie reviews, and you want to hear what me and my girlfriend get up to when we go on holidays and things, and you want to support the show and get early access to certain things as well, all of that is available for £1 a month over at patreon.com/genuinechitchat. If you're unsure and you want to have a bit of a taster, then in the description there should be a link, which is bit.ly bit.ly/TomHanks1. You can either type that into your browser or just click it, and then it'll take you to the Patreon post of our first Tom Hanks episode about Big, where we watch that and you get to consume that completely for free. So yeah, that's gonna be it for me, guys. Please follow me on social media at Genuine Chit-Chat. Check out my conversations with Claudia Gray, with Cavan Scott, with Paolo Villanelli, who's a comic book artist for Star Wars specifically at the moment. He's doing the Bounty Hunters run of comics, and some of the other conversations I've been having that aren't Star Wars related. But please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I want to get my subscriber count up so I can change my channel link name, and it's good to get more views on YouTube as well because it's very public and everyone can kind of see it, even though almost no one listens on YouTube, but still. But yeah, there's lots of ways to interact with me. Just mainly social media is probably the best way. You can email me and check out the show notes for all the other guest spots I've done. I've been on Star Wars Timeline quite a few times now. We did part 2 of our episode on accents. We did them on the original trilogy. We've now done on the prequels, and then I just recorded a conversation with Ben. We talk about villains in Star Wars. So lots of great places. You can listen to me talking, that you can listen to me talking about Star Wars or not or whatever. Lots of different places there. But thank you so much for listening, guys. As always, I appreciate each and every one of you listening, especially all the way to the end. Let me know what you thought of Fallen Star and the other High Republic books. And as always, I'll talk to you next week, and may the Force be with you. The intro for Star Wars Comics in Canon is arranged by myself, Mike Burton, and the backing music was made by Eric Matias of soundimage.org.
You have just experienced host, creator, everything elser of Genuine Chit-Chat, and also the host and creator of Star Wars Comics in Canon, found on the Comics in Motion podcast, Mike Burton.